So now I get to talk about our speaker. And again, Martha Hennessy is Dorothy Day's granddaughter. And that's a wonderful thing. But Martha's a wonderful person of herself, not just because she's Dorothy's granddaughter. Martha has had an interesting life, being in and out of the Catholic Church, raising a family, having an occupation. She's been an occupational therapist. But she returned to the Catholic worker and to her roots as a Catholic. And I think that's the part of the story that she's going to share with you tonight, and that I think that I'm really interested to hear. Martha does have 3 children, and she's got 4 grandchildren, including the one that's on the way, and she's really happy about that. Her family is spread across the country a little bit, but she calls home Vermont, although she also calls home, part of the time, St. Mary Catholic Worker in New York City. And so I invite Martha to come up and just share her life and experiences with us and talk to us a little bit about the history and origins of the Catholic worker, why it's relevant in our lives today, and some of the work that people in the Catholic worker movement have been doing lately, including the protest yesterday. Martha.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been wonderful visiting Iowa. I've been in Omaha, Nebraska yesterday. I've been zigzagging across the state. Frank Cadero lined me up for as many talks as he could get out of me while I'm here in the neighborhood. So it's been a whirlwind of an experience. With any kind of endeavor, I think it's always good to begin with a prayer. So I have what we call some of the Catholic worker mysteries that can be used with the rosary. I'll start with Catholic worker mysteries. The people we can't help, the people who die at our houses, the people who are resurrected at our houses, the people who hinder our work, and the people who help. We also talk a lot about war and peace. We have the mysteries of war. Destruction of homes, villages, cities, crops, and land. Separation of families and imprisonment of dissenters. Contamination of water, degradation of the environment. Torture, wounding, and killing of the living. The mysteries of peace. Reconciliation of enemies. Regrowth and reconstruction of homes, villages, gardens, farms, and the natural environment. Abundance and harmony. The absence of war and the presence of justice. The civilization of love and life. I'll give you a little bit of background of my life. I was born in Staten Island near the Peter Maurin Catholic Worker Farm in 1955. My parents moved to Vermont in 1957 when I was 2 years old. I still live on the same plot of land since 1957. My brother lives next door. He raised his family. I raised 2 kids. Both of my kids were born on the farm. My husband's a carpenter, and we grow perhaps 60% of our food. I feel very blessed. We have fruit trees and grapevines that I planted in my late teens and through my 20s and 30s. And so we have a very abundant harvest there and a very wonderful life. My mother, Tamar, Dorothy's only child, was truly a disciple of Peter Maurin. Peter Maurin talked about life on the land, agronomic universities, and Tamar very much learned that life and taught it to us children. She taught me many skills, putting food by, spinning, weaving. And so it's been an idyllic life there. We've been involved with the Catholic worker most of my life. Dorothy always visited us. She was a single working mother and tried very hard to have enough time with her family throughout the years of very hard work. And so we also spent time at the Tivoli farm. The New York worker houses always try to have a country house and a city house. And the country house grows food to help support the soup lines in the city to feed the homeless and the hungry. And so we spent many summers at the Tivoli farm. It was on the Hudson River just north of New York City. Very, very beautiful place. And when I started to have children, I did not have much time with the worker. My grandmother died in 1980. I was 25 years old. And we attended her funeral at Mary House. I'm sorry, it's not St. Mary's. It's Mary House Catholic Worker in New York. And I didn't step foot into Mary House until 2004, since her funeral in 1980. I was very busy those years, raising my kids, getting myself through college, getting my kids through college, getting my husband through college. It all sort of happened simultaneously at one point. And so I also have been out of the Catholic Church most of my adult life. And a conversion is a very complicated and mysterious thing. And when I was a very young child, I clearly understood Dorothy. We called her Granny. I clearly understood Granny's faith, the strength of her faith. One of my very first memories of her, I was quite a young child, perhaps 3 or 4, and I was sitting on her lap, and she was always coming to visit in Vermont as much as she could, and she was either arriving or departing, and that was always a time of great excitement. And I remember having my ear pressed against her chest and having a very clear sensation of there is some power and love here. And so my memories of her are very dear. And before she died, I did have my first jail experience, and this was in 1979. And I was very uncomfortable with her religiosity by the time I became a teenager. And I always looked at her life within the context of resistance. So I was comfortable with, the resistance of unjust laws. And I couldn't look at the faith component of her life until I turned 50. And I don't know how to explain it other than in 2004, when I first came back to Mary House, I clearly remember a few things occurred. I had a car accident. My son joined the military, and it was Dorothy's birthday, November 8th, 2004, that we destroyed the city of Fallujah. And it was the combination of those two events that really struck at my heart. And I don't know, I just came to a point where I felt that there was something dreadfully wrong here, and I needed to do something in my life to get more involved. So I think we find ourselves coming to God when we are in places of great suffering and confusion. So I did have my first jail experience in 1979, and then I did not participate in any kind of resistance work until 2007. And in 1979, the issue then was nuclear power. We had Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant being built in New Hampshire. And it did go online after many years of protests. But we served a 3-month sentence, which was pretty extreme for leafleting. It turned out that the 4 other people that I did this action with, we all turned out to be Catholics or of Catholic background. And so the one thing that I came away with that experience in prison was we have 2.5 million people in prison in our country. And it's a very, very serious concern. There's very abject conditions in prison. And I came away with that experience. Well, as long as we have prisons, we all need to experience these prisons. And also when I think in terms of the corporal works of mercy, visiting the prisoner, one very good way of visiting the prisoner is putting oneself in their position. So my experiences have been quite varied, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of upcoming trials. So I was very much involved with the issues of the day growing up in the Catholic worker movement. And when I was 14, my brother was drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I clearly remember standing in the kitchen, watching him leave, and not being at all sure that I would ever see him again. But he did survive, in a certain sense he survived. So the issue of war is certainly a personal issue for me. It's something that I've had impact in my family. I work as an occupational therapist. I'm working very part-time now due to my arrest record catching up with me and interfering with my professional career. But I have worked in the VA Medical Center setting. We have a program up in Vermont that is very cutting edge for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I got to see the impact of war on families in that sense as well. Mostly World War II vets at that time, but definitely some, this was the mid-90s, definitely some Gulf War vets as well at that time. I wanted to share with you a little bit about my time at Mary House, what it's like to be working with the poor. Dorothy tried very hard to create a way of providing for the poor in a way that did not separate oneself from them. And I can't help but think of the quote by Vincent de Paul, God forgive us who give bread to the poor. And this business of having the resources and doling them out to others and perhaps expecting gratitude in exchange, it's been a real eye-opener for me to be in that position of working on the soup lines and judging people. And what I found out in terms of my training as an occupational therapist, I clearly understand that a majority of the homeless are suffering from mental illness, untreated mental illness, addiction, other issues. So we really need to be careful about how we view the poor, and we need to be careful about how we serve the poor. And in many cases, the families just could no longer take care of family members, and a lot of homelessness occurs that way as well. So my experience at Mary House is one of a great internal struggle for myself. I mean, I am there not to meet their needs or to improve their lives, but to bring some awareness and awakening to myself. There's a very fine line between guest and worker in terms of how we view the resources, how we view each other, and very often people just need company. They just need to be looked in the eye and listened to and shared. Sharing of the self. Another component in occupational therapy is called the therapeutic use of self, and I find that to be very useful in this work of works of mercy, working in houses of hospitality. I want to give you a little bit of the Catholic worker history, since we do have a lot of students here. The Catholic worker movement started in 1933, and it's very much a movement of the laity. The church does consist 99% of laity, and Dorothy talked a lot about being in the world and seeing Christ in every other person, and also trying to implement the teachings of Christ in our own times. And so the Catholic worker movement was a very good model, I think, for providing the works of mercy within the context of the world. And many of the houses develop their own ministries, whatever their local needs are. They're always encouraged to stay small. There are different varieties of sizes of houses. There is one in Houston that's quite large, but the houses are all encouraged to do what they need to do in their own neighborhoods and with the particular people that they find themselves with. But the basic aims and means, I think, are very important to understand, and I'll review a few of those. Peter Martin's program of action, and Dorothy always called him the founder of the Catholic worker movement. She considered herself simply a co-founder. His program of action in the face of the crisis of the day a crisis that has continued these last 14 years, this was written in 1947, through a Great Depression and a war, and remains the same now as it did when we first met back in 1933. And here we are in the 21st century, and we're faced with the same issues, the same crisis. The Catholic worker was born in a time of extremity, and I think that we find ourselves in rather extreme times now in terms of socioeconomic, ecological issues. And so, unfortunately, we're still addressing the same difficulties. But the other component for us to never forget is that we must always find beauty, and Dorothy considered beauty a part of God. We must always find beauty despite the tragedy. So the Catholic worker movement can sound pretty grim, but we actually have a lot of fun, and we keep a sense of humor. Sense of humor is really important in this line of work. But the 5 points that I want to share with you that Peter Maurin wrote in the 1930s. To reach the man in the street with the social teachings of the Catholic Church. To reach the people through the practice of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy at a personal sacrifice, which means voluntary poverty. Very much the opposite of what we're accustomed to. To build up a lay apostolate through roundtable discussions for the clarification of thought. To found houses of hospitality for the practice of the works of mercy. And to found farming communes for the cure of unemployment. To solve the problems of the machine for the restoration of property and the resisting of the servile state. For the building up of the family, the original community, the first unit of society. So this was provided in the 30s, but we also have a doctrine, a manifesto, that is reviewed in the May issue of the New York Catholic Worker, the aims and means of the Catholic worker. And this was written in the 50s, and it is added to. It's changed as times change. We do update it as much as we think it needs. The aim of the Catholic worker movement is to live in accordance with the justice and charity of Jesus Christ. Our sources are the Hebrew and Greek scriptures as handed down in the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, with our inspiration coming from the lives of the saints, men and women outstanding in holiness, living witnesses to your unchanging love. And that quote comes from the Eucharistic prayer. So the Catholic worker is about examining our society, examining our capitalist system. We look at the economics, private and state capitalism, bringing about an unjust distribution of wealth. We look at labor. Human need is no longer the reason for human work, but with mechanization. We look at politics. The state functions to control and regulate life, and we speak in terms of personalism, taking personal responsibility for the needs of others near us. In morals, discussing issues of class, race, sex, gender, the arms race, and we also advocate for personalism. And again, this is looked at as a philosophy that regards the freedom and dignity of each person as the basis, focus, and goal of all metaphysics and morals. And this comes from the Catholic social teaching of the basic dignity of all people. A decentralized society and a green revolution. And once again, we talk about life on the land, the production of food, and how in the history of the United States, small farms and people have very much been driven off the land. And Peter Maurin talked about, he was a French peasant. He grew up in the south of France on a farm. And he talked a lot about how life on the farm, life on the land contributes to simplicity and living, by our means, avoiding overconsumption. And the other very important tenets of our manifesto, nonviolence, the works of mercy, as we talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. When we take care of the least of our brothers and sisters, we are taking care of Christ. Manual labor, and voluntary poverty. The mystery of poverty is that by sharing in it, making ourselves poor in giving to others, we increase our knowledge and belief in love. And this is not an easy thing to understand, never mind to practice. And I would like to just briefly go over 3 of the basic tenets in the Catholic social teaching that I think the Catholic worker very much builds upon. And again, it's the consistent belief in the human dignity of everyone. The principle of human dignity is grounded in the idea that the person is made in the image of God. And the second component being the dignity of work, the rights of workers. Dorothy was trained as a journalist. That was her vocation. Her father and her brothers were newspaper men. Her father very much discouraged her from joining the world of journalism because it was a man's world at that time. But her early career was in the reporting on the striking workers and the work conditions in the 1920s and 30s, and it was very, very horrendous conditions at that time. The third component being the promotion of peace. Catholic teaching promotes peace as a positive, action-oriented concept. There is a close relationship in Catholic teaching between peace and justice. So Dorothy started this movement. She didn't ask permission from the church. She had varying relationships with the different bishops and cardinals of New York. I think maybe one of the low points was when she supported the churchyard grave diggers. I'm forgetting what year this was, in the 40s, I believe. And she took a stand on the side of the workers, and that caused a lot of difficulty between her and the cardinal, but they seemed to work it out. She always said that she would be an obedient daughter of the church, and if she was told to shut down her work, that she would. But she always prefaced that with, and I'll hand over the 500 people that I'm taking care of to the church to take care of. So she was very, very tough, very gentle, but very tough in keeping her stand and keeping her focus. To just touch upon some of her spiritual practices, she greatly admired the lives of the saints, and she studied them devoutly. And her 2 favorite saints were Therese of the Little Way and Saint Teresa of Avila. And my mother's name was Tamar Teresa. So Dorothy read the lives of the saints very closely. She also attended Mass daily. She prayed the rosary on a very consistent basis. She attended confession on a weekly basis. And she wrote many of her articles and many of her appeals for funds sitting in front of the Eucharist in church. So she was very, very devout. And when she was first converted, she was not at all comfortable or clear with that. She chose the church for it being the church of the masses, the church of the poor immigrants coming to America. But she certainly struggled with the hierarchy, and there is a direct quote from her, "Of course the church is corrupt, but she is our mother, and we must respect the hierarchy and believe in the hierarchy as the teachers of the faith." And so it was a fine line that she walked, and it's not easy for me. I mean, I feel like I spent 30 years of my life having thrown out the baby with the bathwater in terms of not feeling and living with the presence of God, only because I was caught up or tripped up by the human errors and the human inadequacies of the church. I would like to read to you just a small quote. I would encourage everyone to read as much as they can of her primary texts, and those being The Long Loneliness, her autobiography, Loaves and Fishes, where she talks about the Catholic worker movement in the early years, On Pilgrimage, which consists of many of her articles that she wrote for the paper, and From Union Square to Rome. She also wrote a biography on Saint Therese, And I know that I'm forgetting a few in there. The two most recent publications are put out by Marquette University in 2008. The title of the book, The Duty of Delight, talking about her journals, editing her journals. And the most recent book, All the Way to Heaven, The Letters of Dorothy Day. And both of these volumes have been edited by Robert Ellsberg, son of Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers. I would highly recommend those two books for reading, because with that you really gain a sense of her as a person and what she went through on a daily basis in her life. I should talk a little bit about moving from theory to practice in terms of, studying the Catholic worker doctrine and making the leap to really practicing personalism and voluntary poverty. And what I'm currently doing today is working at Mary House in New York and trying to visit as many of the Catholic worker houses just to gain a feel for how all the different houses have developed this model. And it's not an organization, and there's no head person. She worked very hard in the 40s and 50s, traveling around the country, doing a lot of speaking and getting the word out. And the movement grew very quickly. And it was quite knocked back during World War II because she did not believe that there is ever a just war. And she stood against World War II, and that had quite an impact on her readership. But she worked very hard, moving around the country, speaking, talking to seminarians, which is not happening at all today. And the movement is quite strong. And we just had the Sugar Creek Midwestern Faith and Resistance Retreat. I did not attend it, but 50% of the people there are under the age of 25. So it is a growing movement. It's very exciting. And, the different houses and communities run things differently. They're not all Catholics. They're not all practicing Catholics. But I think the beauty of the model is in its tolerances and diversity. None of us are perfect, and we're all flawed, and we're all capable of redemption. And when we keep an open mind and an open heart and really commit ourselves to each other and to community, then it can work. The longevity of some of these communities, 20, 30, 40 years, is quite impressive. I should tell you a little bit about my current focus on resistance. And I don't want to make it sound like resistance is the most important component of this, because I truly believe faith is the most important component. In doing this work of hospitality and in challenging unjust laws, this requires a lot of energy and a lot of personal sacrifice. And the only way that we can sustain ourselves in this work is through our faith. And Dorothy always talked about how if she were ever afraid or embarrassed to mention God, none of this work would have happened. So we really do need to keep our roots based on faith. I have been participating in protesting the Guantanamo Bay prison camp in Washington, D.C. And I've been arrested in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010. We do these fasts, these anywhere from 3 to 12-day fasts. We vigil, we stand and process silently in orange jumpsuits. It's a very difficult act to do. We are protesting indefinite detention. We are protesting extraordinary rendition. We are protesting the suspension of habeas corpus rights. We consider everyone part of the mystical body, and whatever rights are violated in others, our own rights are being violated. And so I was particularly moved by this issue and question of torture. And as an occupational therapist, I have been trained in healing people. And The roots of my profession come from the humane treatment of the mentally ill, but also in the treatment of the shell-shocked of World War I. But I need to share with you the things that have been going on with Guantanamo in terms of torture. And from a perspective of understanding human development, both neurologically and psychologically, I found this incredibly disturbing. The fourfold assault on the human psyche as it's been perfected at Guantanamo Bay prison camp. And the first thing that's used is sensory deprivation and disorientation. A lot of abuse occurring with vision occluded, vision blocked, a lot of auditory assault with extremely loud music, and suffocation, which is what the waterboarding is all about. They're using self-inflicted pain. We're told that things have improved in Guantanamo and that the place was being closed, but it's not. Self-inflicted pain, stress positions through forced self-maintenance, and that's what we saw with that iconic figure. We see all the images of Abu Ghraib, and we have also seen the images of the person standing on a box with wires attached with a hood over the head. It's just a classically CIA approach to torture. Exploitation of cultural sensitivities, the use of dogs. Muslim people are afraid of dogs, do not live with dogs, do not view dogs as being part of their lives, and they're very fearful of them. And the desecration of the Quran. Exploitation of personal fears and phobias and weaknesses, and the use of medical personnel used in this activity, both medical doctors and psychologists. And in 2006, I attended one of my occupational therapy conferences on trauma in Boston, and the topic came up. The American Psychological Association had to do a lot of self-examination because their professionals were involved in this. And it's not talked about, it's not really, there's not a dialogue happening about what this torture truly consists of. So I'm sorry to share this with you, but I think that it's very important to know what our government is doing in our names with our tax dollars. So I do have a trial date, January 3rd. January 11th coming up is the 10th anniversary of the opening of the prison camp. And anyone who is interested can go to Washington, D.C. and participate and see what it is that we're doing and saying about Guantanamo. I have a second trial. This is coming up in Syracuse, New York, and this is around the issue of the use of drones. We just had news recently of the use of drones for what we're calling extrajudicial assassinations. An American citizen was killed without any kind of arrest or trial, and essentially the drones are being used as judge, jury, and executioner to kill people from long distance. I did have a trip to Afghanistan in March, and I got to hear from the families. There's a lot of collateral damage happening, and the CIA is in charge of this program. And here in Omaha, I also just came from the Stratcom Center, where we had an action where 3 people were arrested, an elderly nun, her friend, and an elderly member of the Des Moines Catholic Worker who is a Vietnam vet. They all crossed the line at Stratcom. But we're looking at many, many issues here, and we're looking at the rule of law, we're looking at human rights. So my plate is more than full in terms of addressing these issues. My concern is the violation of human rights. And once again, we are all part of the mystical body, and we are all responsible to each other. And my trip to Afghanistan made it very, very clear to me that this reaching out to the other and meeting the enemy. And we met with the Afghan youth peace volunteers, and these are 14 to 21-year-old kids who have known nothing but war, and many of them have lost family members, either to the Taliban or to the U.S. bombings. and they are committed to peace, and they understand that they could die walking this path, and they are just a tiny little candle in the midst of a huge, huge hurricane, but I have great hope. I mean, they're taking that step, they're doing what they can, and nothing like meeting and hearing the stories, seeing the people, and really trying to understand the truth of what's happening. I think we should open it up to question and answer. Thank you. I guess we don't have a microphone to hand around, so speak very loudly when you have your questions. Oh, good, we do. Thank you.
Okay, anybody who would like to ask a question can come on back here.
Don't be shy. You can ask personal questions and political questions. Okay.
This isn't really a question. You said earlier you wanted to talk something about October 6th.
Oh, yes. October 6th in Washington, D.C., there is a coalition group coming together, and there's a lot happening in the world. The last time that I looked at the front page of the New York Times before coming out to Des Moines, the whole front page was all about global unrest. And there was nothing about domestic unrest, but there is a lot of it happening, as we're seeing with Occupy Wall Street. But also, October 6th, there is going to be an indefinite sit-in. And this is around the issue of war. There'll be many, many peace groups, vets groups involved. And the demand is for President Obama to follow up with ending the wars. And these are all economic issues. Our war economy is depleting and defunding everything else. The Soviets found out with the Afghanistan is considered the graveyard of empires, and I think that that's what we're looking at here in terms of being completely depleted of our resources. And so this October 6th event is addressing that issue. I think that there's a lot of talk about how the Wall Street occupation is not clear in its aims, but the aims are to end corporate greed and to bring the money back to the people, where it's so desperately needed in education and healthcare and infrastructure. So I don't have a lot of detail about that. There should be a website to look that up, but we're trying to get buses together from all around the country to go to Washington October 6th and stay there as long as you can contribute to it. So there's two events, October 6th and January 11th in D.C. Thank you. Yes.
I was really interested in how you said in helping the poor,
Mm-hmm.
you gain as much as the poor. You also
Yes.
mentioned that, I guess, how does your group address the current climate of people assuming that if you are poor, you are lazy, you just have
Right. Yes.
how do you address that?
She's asking the question about the undeserving poor. I mean, we live in a culture where there's a lot of condemnation on the heads of the poor. That people become homeless or people become poor because of character flaws or laziness. That's a tough one. I can't really say that we address it as a group. I mean, we all have to address it individually. We're all dealing with our own imperialistic urges, our own internal imperialistic urges in terms of our attitudes and our judgments. And like I said before, many of the homeless are family members that families could no longer take care of for a variety of reasons. And so this question is asked frequently, And the term undeserving poor does not appear in Scripture at all. It is a term that we have come up with. And I would rather get upset with CEOs and Wall Street guys than someone on the street with no food, filthy clothes, no teeth. But, it's very much ingrained in us, in our culture, to, blame the victims, and our urge is to climb that ladder of affluence. And so it's a turning on the head of what we've been brought up with, and it's not easy. But thank you. Yes. Oh, there's someone who's waiting up at the microphone. Sorry.
That's okay. I just want to share a personal experience that might surprise people, because it surprised me. I talk to a lot of people, and 5 years ago I'm talking to a young man, or a gentleman, and I started talking to him, and it turned out he was one of the last surviving members of the crew of the Enola Gay.
Yes.
And he started talking about the effects after that. And I think when they were on that plane or stuff, they really didn't know what the total destructive damage was going to be.
Yeah.
And then after it happened, and they came back and people found out who they were given all kinds of grief about that, because, quote, you should have known. And he talked to me for a while about it, and it just blew me away. And he made some comment about they all kind of disappeared out of the public life because they kept getting hit and hit and hit by that. And I had a similar experience when I was teaching in the Ukraine in 2003, and we had gone into Iraq then, and the people in the Ukraine found out it was an American. They expected me to tell them why we were doing that, like George Bush calls me up and tells me what's going on. And the same thing, of course, happened to the German people during World War II. They were supposed to know all that bad stuff, and they got blamed for it. So history is a very interesting thing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think that the crew of the Enola Gay suffered terribly. And my brother talked about, fighting with the townies who didn't go over there. And yes, the enemy is within us. The contention and the violence is, it's very easy to train, to scapegoat, and to train our anger and upset towards those who carried out and should have known. But the other side of the coin is we are all complicit. And I think it's very easy to, make that division between those who knew and did it and those who, it's all done in our name. I mean, we marched in the streets in February of 2003. Millions of people around the world marched. And yet this war of aggression proceeded. And I think we need to look at whether we truly do have a democracy. And we need to not blame each other. It's very convenient for the lower echelons of our class structure to be assaulting each other. And so, we're all responsible for our own nonviolent training, and it's a lifelong training. Yes. Can you speak louder?
Social justice,
Mm-hmm.
from a historical perspective, there's a lot of very significant and bad developments in the United States, and I would want you to speak to the young people. What gives you hope that
Mm-hmm.
social justice could come to life in the United States, or do you despair that social
Yeah.
justice is nowhere to be seen and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dorothy said there's no time to despair. There's too much work to be done. We can't wallow in hopelessness. And part of our faith is, we are committed to faith, hope, and charity and love. And that's where my hope comes from. And also the people hold the power. And I think that we're seeing major changes sweeping Egypt. And they're still struggling. This is only the beginning. And the power is in our hands. The few who are running the show are very fearful of the people gaining an understanding and not feeling hopeless and not anesthetizing themselves. We do have the power, and we do need to move forward, and we do need to do it non-violently. There actually is a lot of hope in the world. I mean, in the travels that I have been doing, meeting these people in war zones who have lost everything, and they still manage to be hopeful. And here we are living in the greatest affluence in the history of mankind, and we're despairing. We have the highest standard of living. We're consuming the most resources. We shouldn't be feeling hopeless, and there's a lot that we need to do. Yes.
I participated in a peace march with both your grandmother, Dorothy Day, and Eamon Hennessy.
Oh.
I hope you know.
Tell us your name. Oh, yes, I know Eamon.
Well, I won't mention my name. I talked to her.
Okay, okay.
I happen to be a Protestant, but I'm one of those, along with many Protestants and Catholics, who think Dorothy Day was the greatest Christian in America in the 20th century. Now, Dorothy Day wouldn't admit that. Now, I understand there are some Catholics who would like to canonize her as a saint. I don't think she would want that, but she deserves it. So what is the status now of the process of trying to make Dorothy Day a saint?
Yes, thank you. Some people consider Dorothy's life and work to have kept Catholicism in America alive and true. And she is now identified as a servant of God, which is the first step. And then there's the beatification, and then the canonization, and a few miracles along the way as well need to be found. She said, don't dismiss me that easily. We're all called to do this work. This business of, creating heroes and then not following them. She had another funny quote about Ammon. She said, whenever she was invited to speak to crowds, she would say, if they listen to my talk, they'll leave saying, oh, I just heard a saint speak. If they hear Ammon give his perspective, they'll take the work seriously. They'll say, we need to go act on this. So, I believe she was a saint, and I believe that we need saints like her. I mean, she lived an imperfect life early on in her life. And she was a woman. She was a mother and a grandmother. She was a fully human. And I think the other thing that she protested, besides being, raised up like that and then not having war end, the cost of it, extremely costly, and the money is so desperately needed for other things. So we'll see. The New York Archdiocese is very interested in the cause. And my fear is that they'll airbrush out some of the more important things like anti-war, no war, Christ's teachings of no war, and emphasize other things and de-emphasize that. Thank you. Yes?
You spoke a lot about what you do with your protests. Politically speaking, it sounds like that's a major area of concern. What is your thoughts on the best way to help to change the political spectrum? Would it be through finding a new type of candidate, through these protests, or what would you urge us to do to change these problems?
Thank you. Very good question. I mean, it's one thing toppling the government. It's another thing, what are you going to replace it with? And Peter Martin talked about, creating a new society within the shell of the old. I mean, there are many aspects of our society and our economy and our political system that I think can be retained. And in Vermont, it's interesting, we have a third major political party, the Progressives, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Bernie Sanders. I kind of have given up on the political process. I think that it's very corrupted, and it's big money that's calling the shots, and any kind of candidates that we get are completely beholden to, very few special interests, corporate interests. And I don't know what the political solution is. I think Obama told us what he would do, and maybe if we occupy Washington, D.C., and say, please end the war, please shut down Guantanamo, do all of these things that you campaigned on, the pressure needs to be put on him from the people to do the right thing. The majority of Americans want the war ended. The majority of Americans want a healthcare system that works. That's the definition of a democracy. If we can get the stranglehold of the corporate interests out of the political process, then there's a lot of hope. Thank you.
Hi, I would like to ask, how close are we to achieving pacifism, and can anarchy really be achieved in this society now?
That's kind of abstract. All I can say is, how close are each of us to feeling pacifism? We live in a very violent world, don't we? It's a daily struggle. And I think that's where humility and submitting to the will of God comes in. And what is the most important lesson of our faith is, to love God with all your heart and your mind and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. If we follow those tenets, if we practice those tenets, and that's on a minute-by-minute basis in terms of how we interact with others, how we treat others, and we fail all day long. But each of us has to at least, make that commitment to bringing peace to the world. We're all called to be peacemakers, especially the Christians. And so, when you look at it in such a big picture of how do we bring pacifism now, I don't know. I guess Christianity is quite young and still in its infancy. And we certainly haven't evolved to the level of what we need to before we annihilate ourselves. And I don't know the answer to that either. But thank you.
All right, I just have a question. You brought up Predator drones and how we're using them in the war. I know this is a little bit...
Yeah, Predator and Reaper drones. I don't know a lot about them.
Yeah, but I was just wondering if you would think that the alternative, having soldiers on the ground, would bring any less social repercussions on areas of the Middle East than the Predator drones will?
Yes. Well, who's being killed? I guess that's the question. Whose deaths are more acceptable? It's Gates, the previous Secretary of Defense, talked about the uniqueness and the efficiency of this weaponry. And, yes, it's very efficient. And, yes, we can save soldiers' lives. But I have to ask the question, whose lives are more valuable? And there's also a great concern for the mental health of the people doing the killing. The screen is 17 inches from their faces, and the killing is occurring 7,000 miles away. And they're saying that the instances of PTSD are greater because of this split life that these young men are living. So it's a really tough question.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
I have some comments about your experiences in prison.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a believer in Jesus Christ and He's your Lord and Savior,
Mm-hmm.
your reward is in heaven. In heaven, there are no prison cells. If you've ever read any books by people who have spent 90 seconds in hell or 90 seconds in heaven, you can recognize that people who have written those books have seen jail cells in hell, not in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Those jail cells were meant
for Satan and his fallen angels. And people here in this society claim that you're achieving your righteous reward by being sent to prison because you've broken societal values. Yet I claim that those jail cells are not meant for people who are being morally righteous. They're meant for people like Satan and his fallen angels. So there's a disconnect there with what society does and what's reality in God's world.
I believe in a loving and forgiving God. I believe we all make mistakes. I believe 80% of the prison population were special ed kids whose needs were not properly met. I believe there are better ways to rehabilitate people. And prisons are very expensive, inefficient. I think people would rather be in college than in prison. And I believe in a loving God. I don't believe in extreme punishment. And I believe in people. I have faith in people. That people do want to be good. We need to create a system in which it's easier to be good. And a lot of what I saw in prison were issues of addiction and poverty. So I hope I've answered your question.
I have a question.
Thank you.
You talked about different ways of rehabilitation. What are your opinions on that? Like, how do you think we should be rehabilitating people versus what we are doing right now?
I think it starts with prenatal care and health and nutrition. And from there, at the preschool level, our educational levels, parents who can function, parents who have vocations, physical health, mental health. If we could just prioritize where we're spending our money. We have created a society of consumers. And if you've lost that capacity to consume, you're not worth anything. And if we invested in education and health care, if we brought back 25% of our military budget, there would be so much more money. And we all want to belong, we all want to be successful. I firmly believe that. And I firmly believe that children raised in poverty and violence do not have a chance. And we have the capacity. We have the capacity to create heaven on earth, to meet each other's needs, to meet our own needs. It's just a question of sharing in the end. The massive accrual of wealth while others are going without the most basic needs. It's a very disordered world. And I think we're quite capable of doing better than that. It's 9:00. We have two other questions.
Yeah, so why don't we have this question here and then this one?
Okay.
One of the things you talked about was family. I was struck by the thought of your father at some point having to take out Dorothy Day's daughter for birthday. In growing up in that household, I suppose, what lessons do you see that you got from not just your grandmother, but your mother,
Yes.
sort of how to have an ideal family?
I had a abnormal family. I'm number 7 of 9 children, and there's a lot to be learned growing up in a big family in terms of being a community member. And my mother was 18 when she married. She was quite young. My father was Catholic. My father left the family when I was 6 years old. He could not raise 9 children. I think that my mother had all the qualities that Dorothy had, and even more so in many ways. Not only did she raise 9 children, but she took in many teenagers and gave them a home when they most needed it. She practiced the works of mercy and had her own house of hospitality. And even her mother complimented her on that at one point, that she truly was following the ways of Christ. So the definition of a normal family, I mean, I have a very happy childhood memories. Growing up out in the country, big family, big house, lots of books in the house. But it was abnormal. They were suffering. I have a brother who died at a young age, or alcohol-related death. So every family has suffering, and especially in our American culture. But as far as my father dating my mother, I don't know how that went. I think that it must have been pretty formidable to have that kind of a mother-in-law. Yes, one more question.
Along the lines of the violence in prisons, what are your views on the death penalty? And is it really an effective way to deal with criminals nowadays, or are there other ways you can deal with prisoners in, let's say, Guantanamo Bay or other places?
Thank you. No, I don't believe in capital punishment. I think what just recently happened with Troy Davis is absolutely appalling, and it illustrates our moral state at this point. If you're Catholic, you don't believe in taking the life of another. The seamless garment of no abortion, no war, no capital punishment, no euthanasia. And as far as capital punishment being a deterrent, I don't know that there's any, social scientific studies that show that it truly is a deterrent. And I think the instances of killing innocent people is very high. And what about that? What about the state killing of innocent people? There's too much room for error there. So I do not believe in capital punishment. I never did, even as a child. It was pretty clear to me. And one reason I gave up on the Democratic Party at one point was President Clinton. He was for the death penalty. Thank you very much.